Let me add my welcome and thanks that you made time out of a busy schedule to come and listen to a talk on usury. An odd term, perhaps, not one that is in common parlance. It's not common to those with English as a first language. It's not common to those even typically in financial circles. It's a term that is more a term of jargon or a legal sort of term. You'll find it amongst lawyers, perhaps, talking about finance, but very few others. So I want to begin by starting with some brief descriptions, definitions of usury, and then what that has to do with Jewish, Christian, Islamic, and other perspectives on financial arrangements, on financial transactions, particularly on what today we call credit transactions, perhaps even what we carry in our pockets, credit cards, and what it means for us to take seriously our religious traditions to which we might be committed, and at the same time participate in modern economic activity around the world. So, what just is usury? Let me give you a couple brief definitions. The term usury may be broadly defined as interest in excess of the amount allowed by law. More specifically, the term usury has been variously defined as the exaction, taking, or receiving, or the contracting for or charging of a greater rate of interest than is allowed by law for the use of money. We could go to the next slide, please. There are a variety of capitalisms, and I won't take time to go through the entire list, but I want to draw your attention in particular to the last one on the list, and that is finance or financial capitalism. One of the significant differences as we move throughout history, and there are a variety of capitalisms, that is a way of understanding how money is used to create profit, how money is used to create more money. Financial capitalism or finance capitalism, a form of capitalism which is broadly practiced, is broadly in place in the world today, is where money itself is a commodity. Money itself is bought and sold, so that there's a significant focus on making money with money without the production of any other good or service. The focus is just money. The next slide, please. And so the definition of usury, and the principal definition, like the one I just read out from a manual for lawyers, is interest paid on a loan that's above the maximum rate permissible by law. That is, there are a variety of legal restrictions or legal maximums, legal limits. It's okay to charge interest up to that limit. Anything over is what is called usury. So it's just a charge that's too high, according to the law. And that interest, or that payment for the use of money, includes a wide range of charges. For example, interest can be compensation for the forbearance of money, as damages for its unlawful detention, as compensation paid for the use of money, as payment or compensation for the loss of use of money, or the rental price of money, the time value of money. You might have heard that phrase. That's much more common. Interest is defined as money paid to compensate for the delay and risk involved in the ultimate repayment of monies loaned. In brief, interest is the price charged by the creditor and paid by the borrower for access to and use of money or credit for a specified period of time. As the maximum amount of interest to be charged and paid for given transactions is frequently fixed by law, usury is charging and paying of interest in excess of that which is legally permitted. So, usury is bad, interest is, well, it's not good, but it's okay. It's not illegal. But it wasn't always so, that there was this distinction between usury, bad, and interest permissible. Not that long ago, certainly not that many centuries ago, looking at it from both Jewish, Christian, and Islamic perspectives, there existed no essential difference, certainly no practical difference from the understanding of religious leaders and from many religious communities. No difference between usury and interest, at least with regards to standard consumer transactions, that is, individuals seeking a loan for the sake of consumption. Usury, quite simply, was the charging of any interest on a loan of money or of fungible goods like food. There was no such thing as a rate of interest that could be charged, paid, and justified. And this, the last quote on the screen, as Pope Benedict XIV noted in his 18th century encyclical, usury is any excess value charged or given in a mutuum, yielding the creditor any gain which exceeds the amount loaned. And the mutuum was a technical term for a contract between a creditor and a debtor, where what is being loaned is anything that can be weighed or counted and is used to enable consumption on the part of the debtor. Though the Church's position, that is in particular the Roman Catholic Church and the Christian position in general, on usury is further developed and refined over the years, and this is where we get the split today, particularly in Western and secular economies, of usury is illegal but interest is okay. The earlier and broader conceptualization of usury, that usury is interest and both are illegitimate, that was and remains the position shared by Judaism and Islam, both in the Middle Ages, when Pope Benedict was speaking, and today. Usury itself has we might say a checkered past. It's always been condemned. It's always been controlled. Much of the time it has been banned, though it nevertheless always manages to continue. The oldest written records that we have available from about 3,000 years before the Common Era, 3000 BCE, and they're Sumerian records of loans, of grain and tax payments to sovereigns, to rulers. Indeed, it seems the development of writing and mathematical calculations coexist with financial transactions. Our very word calendar originally refers to a book of accounts or a book of debts. The Code of Hammurabi, going back about 2,000 years in Mesopotamia, set a maximum rate of interest and rules concerning who bore the cost of loans when they go bad, like when bad weather destroys crops, and it was on the basis of crops that payment was to be made on the loan. In the 6th century BCE, Solon of Athens permitted usury, but he did abolish debt slavery, something we didn't manage to accomplish. Some of you may have heard of debtors' prisons, for example, in the West, in Britain, even in the United States. Debtors' prisons weren't outlawed until the 18th century. The 12 Tables of Rome, that's about 450 years BCE, set the first annual percentage rate for loans, a maximum at 12%. The Janussean laws of the 4th century banned usury altogether between Roman citizens, and that's extended in the 2nd century BCE when Caesar prohibits usury, and then later, because of some financial difficulties, he relents and permits usury, reverting to the 12% rule. So it's not just religions that have long said that usury is an evil, so have secular leaders, secular rulers. Another quick quotation, this one I rather like, from Cato, 2nd century BC, a Roman leader. Cato is asked and gives his recommendations for the best ways of making money. When he is then asked, what is to be said of making profit by usury? Cato replies, what is to be said of making profit by murder? In another text, he says, "It is true that to obtain money by trade is sometimes more profitable than farming, were it not so hazardous. And likewise money-lending, if it were as honorable. Our ancestors held this view and embodied it in their laws, which required that the thief be mulcted double." That is, the fine when you were caught for being a thief meant you had to pay your victim and the court double what you had stolen. The thief would be mulcted double, the usurer fourfold. How much less desirable a citizen they considered the usurer than the thief, Cato goes on to say, one may judge from this. What about the religious traditions themselves? Next slide, please. From the Judaic tradition, a variety of verses in the Jewish, the Hebrew scriptures are noted. The one in particular that I have on the screen: "You shall not deduct interest from loans to your countrymen, whether in money or food or anything else that can be deducted as interest." In other passages, it's clear that the reference to not taking interest or not charging usury, and again, those words are understood to be the same, is for the protection of those who otherwise are poor, who otherwise cannot afford to remain full economic members of the community. But the passage here from Deuteronomy is not just focusing on those who are poor, but in fact is universal, or at least is universal with regards to those who are insiders in the community. The passage also goes on to note that it's okay to charge interest to foreigners, but not to those who are within Israel. Next slide, please. Within the Christian tradition, there are, interestingly, very few passages in the Christian scriptures in what we call the New Testament. One in particular that seems to apply in this case, from the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus says, "Love your enemy and do good, lend without expecting repayment." And there's been some controversy about exactly what's to be understood by not expecting repayment. Does that mean that you don't expect interest? You'll get your principal back, that is the money that you lend. If I lend you $100, I expect to get the $100 back, but no more. Or is Jesus saying, you lend the $100, not only do you not get interest, you shouldn't expect your $100 back either. And there's one interesting episode that's shared by all the Gospels. There are lots of stories that are only in one or two Gospels, but there's one that's in all four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that's the episode that is sometimes labeled the cleansing of the temple. That is, Jesus is in the temple precincts, and he overturns the tables of the money changers and drives out the animals and those who are selling the animals for special sacrifices. And what's interesting is that Jesus should drive out the money changers, since money changing itself was related both to taxation on the one hand and to usury on the other. And he drives them out saying, you've made this area, the temple precinct, which is supposed to be sacred, you've made it a den of thieves, identifying the money changers with the usurers, just as did Cato. Next slide, please. And then within the Islamic tradition, and there are a few passages in the Quran as well, but this one in particular, "But those who take usury will rise up on the day of resurrection like someone tormented by Satan's touch. That is because they say, trade and usury are the same, but God has allowed trade and forbidden usury." So within all three traditions, the Jewish, the Christian, the Islamic traditions, it's also in Hinduism and Buddhism and a few other traditions around the world, usury is held to be illegitimate, and there is no distinction between usury and interest. It's illegitimate. The next slide, please. I've already provided you a bit from Hammurabi and Cato and a bit of the Greek and Roman practices. Let me move very quickly to the more modern, or at least nearer modern period, to Dante. Dante's an Italian poet. What can he tell us about usury? Some of you may be familiar with his, what is called the Divine Comedy. It's a long poem in 3 acts. The first act is the Inferno, where he defines his trip through hell. The second act is his travels through purgatory. His third act is a journey to heaven. In the Inferno, that first portion of the Divine Comedy, Dante is introduced through all the levels of hell, and he sketches for us in his poetry 9 levels, 9 rings, each one slightly lower down than the other, and as you go down in hell, it gets worse and worse. So ring 1, where he picks up his guide Virgil, is to be separate from God, but is not yet to be being punished by God. Down through the 9th ring, the 9th level, where Satan himself is, very interesting, ensconced in ice, not in fire, but in ice. Well, he makes the travels through all 9 levels, 1 through 9, and in level 7, which itself is divided into 3 separate rings, again, rings 1, 2, and 3, where each is successively worse than the other. Ring 1 holds those who act against the neighbor. Again, this is at level 7, but the first ring of level 7. They act against neighbor. Ring 2 is those who act against themselves. That's interesting. Acting against yourself can actually be worse than and require more punishment from God than acting against neighbor. The lowest ring of level 7 is acting against God. Violence against God. Quoting from the Dante's Inferno. Violence may be done against the deity by denying and blaspheming him in the heart, and by despising nature and her goodness. And therefore the smallest ring, that is this 3rd ring, because they also contract as you travel down in hell, the smallest ring seals with its mark both Sodom and Cahors, and all who speak condemning God in their heart. And what is this reference to Sodom and Cahors? Well, of course, Sodom is a reference to the Sodom of the Genesis account in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities that are destroyed by a firestorm. The account is often interpreted as being because of forms of sexual deviancy that God has to destroy. And I'm not sure that's the best way to understand what Dante was getting at. And I don't think was the way that was understood by his readers, because remember, this is being also combined with the condemnation of those of Cahors. What's that reference to Cahors? Cahors is actually a city in southern France where there were a significant number of usurers who spanned out across Europe. They were Gentiles, though they were often called Jews just because they handled money and were usurers. It's one interesting difficulty in handling some medieval manuscripts and reading through them and attempting to discern just who it is that's being talked about. The fact that it's a Jewish usurer may still be a Gentile, but someone who comes from southern France, like from Cahors. So I don't think that what we have here is a combination of sexual deviancy on the one hand and monetary deviancy on the other that's being punished, but rather that there is a common offense. A bit further in this same canto, this same explanation of his travels through hell, Dante asks Virgil, his guide, why usury offends the divine goodness. And the response is that by nature and by art, if you remember Genesis at the beginning, it behooves man to gain his bread and to prosper. That is, we must work even though it be by the sweat of the brow. But because the usurer takes another way, he condemns nature in herself and in her follower, for he puts his hope elsewhere. That is, rather than taking God's way and nature's way of making a living, he makes it on the backs by extracting usury or interest from others. And I say this is interesting with regards to Sodom because the prophet Ezekiel, in speaking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem, gives a different explanation for the destruction of Sodom. It's not sexual deviancy at all. Ezekiel, talking about Jerusalem, look at the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were proud, sated with food, complacent in their prosperity, and they gave no heed to the poor and needy. In short, there's a sin, a serious sin shared by both Sodom and Cahors, and that's the refusal to use one's wealth for the benefit of the community, especially the poor and the needy, seeking another way rather than God's way or nature's way. Dante is 14th century, and of course there's a good deal of Catholic theology, as the good Catholic boy that he was, that's wound up in his account of his visit to hell and then purgatory and heaven. So let me jump to the 20th century. A fellow by the name of John Maynard Keynes, one of the leading economists of the 20th century. And Keynes notes, provisions against usury are amongst the most ancient practices of which we have record. I was brought up to believe that the attitude of the medieval church to the rate of interest was inherently absurd, that the subtle discussions aimed at distinguishing the return of money loans from the return to active investment were merely Jesuitical attempts to find a practical escape from a foolish theory. But I now read these discussions as an honest intellectual effort to keep separate what the classical economic theory has inextricably confused together, namely the rate of interest and the marginal efficiency of capital. That there's been a confusion, in other words, of commercial return on money invested to make profit and interest return on money without regard for production. Next slide, please. Well, if that was the attitude of so many, even up to the 20th century, a leading economist like Keynes, what happened? Why is it that we have these little plastic cards in our pocket called credit cards and we pay interest? How is it that we get mortgages for our homes and pay interest? How is it that we buy cars and we pay interest? How is it you can run down to a furniture store and get furniture on time and pay interest? How is it we can do almost anything today and it requires signing a contract that specifies interest? If, in fact, there were strong religious and other traditions against the practice. Well, there were obviously some developments, economic developments, that movement through capitalisms, that first slide that I didn't want to spend too much time on, and how it is that there were economic transactions which seem to be new, have a different sort of character from past transactions, so we want to treat them a little differently. And I don't want to go into detail and bore you unmercifully. But just a couple broad sweeps of what it is that happened, how it is we got to where we are today, at least in Western economies like in the United States. Well, first, what was called interest becomes interest. Interest originally was a payment that was to be made to a creditor when a loan which had been advanced, and no interest was to be charged, but when the loan that was advanced wasn't paid on time. And so it's like paying damages. I loan you $100, you're supposed to pay me at the end of the month. You don't pay me at the end of the month, well then I am damaged. It's not that you owe me interest, it's just now I was expecting to get my $100 back. I was going to use that $100 for some other project. You haven't paid me, I don't have that money, now I am damaged, now you owe me. For the damage, not for the money that I loaned you, but you owe me for the damage that I now must bear. And in the beginning, that interest was usually 100% of the loan. I loan you $100, you don't pay me on time, then you owe me $200. Well, that actually begins to evolve where we talk about, well, this interest, which is damages for you not paying me money, becomes recognized as, well, but I'm losing opportunity to use my $100 that I have loaned you, not just for the period of time that I've given it to you, whether it be 1 month or 6 months or 1 year. It's not just at the end of that period that I have lost the use of that money. It's for the entire time that I've given you the loan that I've lost the use of that money. And so I am damaged because I don't have the $100, you do. So you owe me for some of that damage that I incur by actually advancing you the loan. And so the notion that there's a damage that needs to be covered, that needs to be paid for, in addition to the money that is loaned, becomes what's called an extrinsic title. That is, what you owe me is extrinsic to, and apologies for the technical terminology, it is outside of, it is separate from the actual money that has been loaned to you. So you're actually paying me for 2 different accounts now. You're paying me back for the loan that I've given you, and you're paying me back for this extrinsic, this separate related transaction into which we now speak of the loan. The loan of the money, which is free of interest, and the damage that I incur because I loan you the money, because now I'm without that money for a certain period of time. Those extrinsic titles, those separate transactions, become the norm. It's a way of engaging in the transactions and getting around the authorities who say, but you shouldn't do it that way. Think about it for a moment. So many of the transactions occur something like this. You come to me for some money, and I say, okay, I'll give you $100. When do you think you can pay me? I could probably pay you in 3 months. I say, okay, you will pay me in 3 months, but we will write the transaction as though you will pay me in 1 month. And then you will owe me damages because, in fact, you're not going to pay me until 3 months. And so what we're doing is lying, committing fraud. But it's an agreed fraud between you and me because we want to get our deal past the authorities. And so you're going to agree to pay me interest in order to get the money, and it's going to appear to the authorities that really you're just paying me damages. That becomes normative. That becomes the usual means then of doing business. Of course, there's expanding commerce, and particularly after the Reformation, and for Protestant Christianity, the fact that we pay interest on virtually everything that we buy these days goes back to Luther and Calvin. Martin Luther, the great reformer, John Calvin, the great reformer, who themselves reformed economic laws along with religious laws, along with a significant change in theology. They make it normative for Protestant Christianity. The most important move, I think, is the last one that I have listed on the slide, and that is a movement from malum in se to malum prohibitum. And what that means is malum in se, it is evil in and of itself, either because it has been revealed to us that it is evil, God or Allah has spoken to us and told us, revealed to us in Scripture that it is evil, so there's the prohibition in all of our Scriptures. Or we recognize, as did secular writers like those in Rome, prior to any revelations, that it's just not the way to manage a community, to manage a state, to manage an economy. It was evil in itself. The move is from something being evil in itself to it's evil just because it's prohibited. That it's evil because we have decided to prohibit it, but since we're the ones who've decided to prohibit it, we are also the ones who can decide that it's permissible. So that transaction where we agree between ourselves to lie to the authorities, and the authorities pick up what's going on, and the authorities wind up saying, well, you know what? If you've agreed, if you have freely entered into this arrangement, then maybe we ought to say it's okay. And we should seek prohibiting it on the basis of a revelation or some other external authority, which no one seems to be paying much attention to anyway. There's one other important factor involved. How are we to understand, not just as economists, but as members of an economy, how are we to understand interest rates? Why is it 12%? Why is it 14%? How is it that mortgage rates move so that it's 4 or 6 or 8%? Why is it that credit cards can be as high as 30%? Why is it if you get a payday loan, if you work out the annual percentage rate, it'll be over 300%? Why a particular rate of interest at all? How do we calculate it? How do we understand it? Again, not just as economists, but as users of credit in a modern economy. There have actually been quite a variety of theories of interest rates. Economists themselves can't agree on what interest represents and how to calculate it. But again, if I could refer to Keynes, who advanced a theory of interest rates which I think captures at least the psychology of interest rates very well, even if it doesn't capture interest rates economically very well. Interest represents, says Keynes, the price an individual borrower is willing to pay to have more money now, and so is willing to mortgage the future for the sake of current consumption. That is, you increase your current liquidity, you're broke, and getting the loan means now there's money in your pocket, by privileging the present over the future. That is, it's more important for you to have the money now, even though you'll have to pay it back at some future date. On the other hand, it likewise represents the price an individual lender is willing to receive to decrease current liquidity or purchasing options now. I give you $100, that's $100 less in my pocket for me to spend. And I thereby privilege the future over the present. I'm willing to give up my purchasing options now for the sake of receiving my money back plus interest in the future. And where the wills, that is the ideas and the bargaining, the negotiating between these two parties, the one who wants to privilege the present versus the one who is willing to privilege the future, where our negotiations meet is the rate at which the transaction can be done. That is, that you and I sit down together to agree that 6% or 8% or 300% is the appropriate rate. Now, why I think that's a telling account, at least psychologically, if not economically, is that it means that by talking in terms of usury or interest, and again, I want to go back to using those terms interchangeably, they mean the same thing, means that we are selling or mortgaging time, that we are selling or mortgaging our own future, and we engage in what I call universal quantification. That is, that we conceive of life as discrete as individual yet uniform moments of time, and that's how we relate different goods and services, or what we consume, by discrete and uniform monetary units. So let's think about that for a moment. We sell or mortgage time. Who are we to sell or mortgage time? Time is not ours. Time is not under our control. Time is not in my hands. Time is in God's hands. If I'm selling or mortgaging time, I'm selling or mortgaging what is His, not my own. I am acting against God and against nature, like Dante's usurer. Or I'm selling or mortgaging the future, my individual future. Is my future in my hands? No more than is time in general in my hands. I am in God's hands. My future belongs to Him. I will live it. But its length and what I do is His, not mine. So once again, I take from Him and pretend I have control over that which I do not, so that I can sell it or mortgage it. And universal quantification just means that I refuse to see that there are any distinctions between moments of time, or between persons, or between goods. I make them all the same. They are discrete and uniform and boring, because it all comes down to money. Is that right? Is the great diversity of what God has created boring? Uniform? Discrete? Or an interconnected, interrelating, dependent system of relationships between ourselves and with Him, our Creator? What are we doing reconceiving and reconceptualizing and selling and mortgaging that which is not ours? Now, what I find, and I say this with some trepidation, what I find very challenging by this sort of analysis is that then when I pull out my credit card, I'm committing blasphemy. Because what is blasphemy but to say, God, you're not in charge. You're not in control. I can do as I will. And I can do with what I have as I will. The word that we transliterate, that we say anti, A-N-T-I, in English, that comes from the Greek, can mean that which is against, or that which is a replacement for. So you can think of, say, an anticoagulant drug, and that means, well, it's a drug that acts against the coagulation of platelets in the blood, so the blood can continue to flow. But you can also think of the anti as the antifreeze, which we place in our automobile radiators, which is not only against, say, freezing, not something we usually worry about too much in Southern California. Antifreeze also acts against boiling. Go figure how the English puts that together. Antifreeze is to avoid boiling. But it's also a replacement. It's a replacement for the water that we put in our radiators. Same thing with the notion of an antichrist that you find in much of the Christian scriptures. In the general letters of John, for example, the reference to antichrist is not just a figure, a being that is opposed to Christ, that is against Christ, but is a replacement Christ. then interest is a replacement for a recognition of our reliance on God, a recognition that the future is in His hands and not in our own. And we are acting, again to use Dante's figure, against God and against nature. Can we get around it? Can we avoid it? Are there alternatives? There are some. There are some that are being developed, what is today called Islamic banking in a number of countries around the world, including some options that are becoming available in places like Great Britain and the United States. But there are not many, and it is difficult to pull off. Are we stuck? Are we necessarily stuck with our credit cards, with our mortgages, with our interest payments on all that we have, all that we buy? Yes and no. I mean, yes, we're stuck. I mean, that's the way the economy works. You don't have many options. But no, there are some options. And they're not always easy options. Let me close very quickly with just a short story, a tale from a book of Sufi tales. A Sufi by the name of Nasreddin is eating his chickpeas and stale bread, living in a small ramshackle shack. Not far away is another Sufi scholar, living in a grand home and eating sumptuous meals. And Nasreddin's friend says, Nasreddin, all that I have comes from the emperor. And if you would just learn to be subservient to the emperor and speak as you know he needs to hear, you too could live in a large home and eat good food. To which Nasreddin responds, but you, dear friend, if you could learn to eat chickpeas and stale bread, you would not have to be subservient to the emperor. Thank you for your attention.